Hey y'all, I'm Hope. Welcome back to my channel. So I've been thinking a lot lately about required reading, and this is because I've just recently enrolled in a Master's in English program, which I'll be starting in the fall, and I'm very excited about this. And it's interesting because it's going to be a big leap for me because my background is in psychology and sociology, but I'm excited. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I feel really good about the direction that I'm going with my education. But because I'm starting this new program, I've been thinking a lot about when the syllabi come in, what is the required reading for these courses going to look like? And part of that is because what I've often found for myself is that required reading is almost never something I would have picked up for myself. But for the most part, I find that I enjoy them a lot more than I expected. So I've been thinking about this a lot while I'm waiting to get my syllabi, which is going to be a while yet because it's like May and we're just coming up to commencement for the people graduating in the spring. So it's going to be a while yet. Because of that, I thought today it would be fun to talk about some of the books that I've had to read as required reading that I think are worth your time, that I would recommend you pick up without being required to read them. So I picked some from high school. I think I have at least one for every year of my high school years, and then I've picked several that I read in college because those are obviously going to be the freshest to my mind. I've read them most recently. So the book that I picked for 9th grade is In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez, sorry. This one is a historical fiction that is based on true events, but it follows the 4 Mirabal sisters, I believe. But it follows these 4 sisters who all live in the Dominican Republic and get involved with the revolution in the 1960s. And it follows their fates as they get involved in various different ways and the relationships that they form. And it's just a really fascinating look at that time in history, at what life was like in the Dominican Republic under, General Rafael Trujillo during that dictatorship. So, based on true events, but really, really emotional, very much a gut punch of a book. I remember crying multiple times reading this, but the journey that these sisters go on over the course of the book is just so fascinating, and it's all told from the perspective of the last sister who has survived. So I think it's really interesting, and it's just fascinating to see how these different sisters, who have wildly different personalities and abilities, how they each individually kind of get drawn into this effort to end a dictatorship. And I just really enjoyed this one way more than I would have expected. So in 10th grade, we had World Lit, and my favorite from that was Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. This is a play that was translated from the original French, and it follows this guy named Cyrano de Bergerac, as predicted by the title. And he's really self-conscious. Like, he's really intelligent and witty and very good at fighting. He's like not a musketeer, but I can't remember what the word for it is. Maybe it is a musketeer. He's a soldier. Anyway, he's really good at all these different things, but he's got a really big nose, and he's really self-conscious about that. And he's in love with this woman, and he's like, there's no way I'm anywhere near being in her league. So he just kind of adores her from afar. But then this new guy gets assigned to his battalion, and he's really attractive, but quite stupid. And he's also in love with the same woman, and so they end up forming this partnership to woo her with Christian's looks and Cyrano's wit. And it's just a very funny play. It's a comedy with a kind of tragic element to it, but it's really funny. I think that the dialogue in here is fantastic, and I love Cyrano as a character. Christian is also really interesting, so there's some really fantastic characters, and then the woman that they're both in love with is really interesting as well. I really like her and the way that she kind of stands up to get what she wants in a situation where she's kind of expected to behave in certain ways. So I really enjoy all the characters in here, and I love the way that this kind of romance story plays out. This is one I come back to and reread pretty frequently just because I enjoy it so much. And then for 11th grade, I picked one that I don't actually own, but I picked The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which is also a play. And this one is kind of an interesting play about the Salem witch trials. It's about this town where people become increasingly hysteric over the possibility of witchcraft, and a number of people are killed. And that's basically what the play is about that, the mentality that led to the deaths of all of these innocent people. But I think it's a really interesting introduction to the idea of the Salem witch trials and kind of that era. And also, there's a really great scene. You will find yourself yelling, "Because it is my name!" constantly after reading this, because that's what my entire class did. We had one guy who, like, during the talent show, everybody was like, "Get on stage and do the thing," because he was really good at it. So, like, it's really an interesting play, and it really tackles a lot of dark material, but has an interesting levity to it. So I thought it was really well done, and it's one of my other favorite plays besides Cyrano de Bergerac. And then I have several for my 11th grade year, because we read quite a few things that I ended up loving. The first two here are ones that I had to read for my summer reading project. I am going to set my phone down back here. So for the summer reading project, my English teacher always did a thing themed around monsters. So I was in AP English and we had to read two books, and the first one we had to read was Grindel by John Gardner. This is the story of Beowulf, but retold from the monster's point of view. And I just think this book is fascinating. It's so interesting about how Grindel is cast as a monster without necessarily being one, and how that alters his perception of the world and how he interacts with the world, and about how myths are made. And it's just really interesting seeing this story from Grindel's perspective. Also, I think the writing in here is really lovely. And then the other book we had to read was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is one of my all-time favorite classics. I just love this story. Obviously, this is about Frankenstein who builds a monster, and I really enjoyed this book thematically. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here about kind of Frankenstein's hubris, and how a lot of what happens to him happens because he's so caught up in himself that he doesn't heed the advice of others, and he doesn't necessarily recognize that there are going to be consequences for people besides himself. But also it's really fun because Frankenstein's really dramatic, and he's constantly just fainting to avoid all of his problems. So I think it's really fun, but it's also just really thematically interesting, and also a very accessible classic. I think the language in here is pretty easy to get into. My battery is flashing, so let me replace that and then we'll get back to it. And we're back. Hooray for fresh batteries. I'm so glad I thought to order a second one for this camera, because otherwise I'd be shit out of luck. Next, we're into stuff I read in college. Kind of forgot what year I was talking about at this point. But the first two I read for a Russian literary film adaptations course. So first up, we read Crime and Punishment. This is a 600 plus page book, and this is the one that I think has the biggest caveat for it, which is that my Russian lit teacher talked about how she's found that most people either love Dostoevsky and the kind of descriptive, not quite flowery, but very in-depth language that he uses here, and the kind of focus on character psychology, and like everything is symbolism and everything has this specific meaning that you can kind of like pick apart. Or you tend to like the very direct and more thematic, straightforward writing of Tolstoy. I found this to be true for me. I love Dostoevsky. I didn't really enjoy Tolstoy at all. So I think if you don't like very in-depth looks at character psychology and very heavy symbolism, you may not like this one, and it's 600 plus pages, so in that case, I'd say maybe steer clear of this one. That may not be as worth your time, but if any of that sounded interesting to you, and you like kind of stories about murder and about law and philosophy and ethics and morality and all kinds of different things, if that sounds interesting to you, this one is 100% worth your time, and I don't think you should be intimidated by the length, because it is very descriptive and kind of verging on flowery. It's not really quite the right word, but I don't know what word I'm looking for there. It's very intricate language, but I don't think it's necessarily hard to read. It's just very layered with symbolism, so there's like a lot of stuff to pick apart. So if you like doing that, this one's definitely worth your time. The other one I read for that class was Heart of the Dog by I get this wrong every time. Teacher made me say it until I got it right. Mikhail Bulgakov. Anyway, this is Heart of a Dog, and it's about a guy who implants the pituitary gland of a criminal into a dog, and the dog turns into a humanoid dog and enters the new bureaucracy that is kind of emerging after the Bolshevik Revolution. It's a very weird book. It's very on the side of speculative, and it's just strange. This is the same author who wrote The Master and Margarita, which I haven't read but have heard is similarly like very strange. But this one is much shorter, and I found this one to be a very quick read. I read it in like a day. I don't have much to say about this other than it's very strange. It is a really interesting commentary on society and the revolution that was happening and the changes that were taking place in society at the time. It's also got a lot in it about like youth and rebirth and that kind of search for regeneration, which I think was really interesting. That's kind of a major theme in here with the doctor who created Sharikov. Lots of interesting things thematically, but also if you just want a deeply weird story about a dog that turns into a man. The next two were both books I read for a class called Literary Cartography, which is about like space and place in literature, both like spaces and places in literature, so things like, you know, fantasy worlds have maps and like what is the geography of the place, but also like specific rooms or specific placements of things within stories, but also about like where is the author from and how does that inform their writing, and where are you from and how does that inform your reading of the book, and how does where you read it and when you read it inform your reading of the book. So it's all that kind of stuff. It was a really fascinating course. Hated the first book that we read for it. Loved the other two. And the first one that we read after that was Mother Tongue by Demetria Martinez, which is a book about this young woman named Mary who's living with her aunt after the death of her mother, I believe. But she's living with her aunt in Albuquerque, and she and her aunt end up taking in a refugee who is fleeing from the El Salvador Civil War, and he stays with them for several months while he's getting his papers in order so that he can go to Canada to seek asylum. It's about Mary's relationship with Jose Luis and about how he helps her kind of reconnect with her family's roots. Her family is Hispanic and she's just never quite felt like she fits in. She's not really connected with that part of her family's history. And so it's about him kind of helping her reconnect with that part of her identity and also helping her figure out where she wants to go in life, who she wants to be, because she's feeling quite stuck. She's just like living with her aunt and working at this restaurant, and she doesn't really know what she wants to do or what kind of a person she wants to be. And it's about how encountering him and his kind of worldview forces her to rethink her own worldview and start thinking about who she wants to be. And it also just has like a really interesting relationship develop between them. And then we also read A Room with a View by E.M. Forster, which is a classic written in, I think, like the early 1900s. But this one follows Lucy Honeychurch, who goes with, I think it's her cousin, to Italy. And while there, she ends up meeting a group of different people. And this is kind of similar to to Mother Tongue. A Room with a View is a book about a young woman developing relationships with people around her and encountering people who force her to rethink her worldview and really decide what kind of a person she wants to be and what kind of life she wants to have. So it's about that. Both of these do contain a romance element, and I really liked that in both of them. And also, I just love the protagonists of these. Lucy Honeychurch is kind of naive to begin with. I think Mary is to an extent as well. But Lucy is particularly naive and just kind of wants to believe the best about people, and is interesting to see how she grows across the story. The next one I read for a literary theory course. This was one of my 2 upper level undergraduate English courses I took kind of in preparation for applying for a master's. And for this one, we just had one book that we read, but we read it a lot and we talked about it for the full semester. And this was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by Unknown. This is a really weird story, and I feel more confident recommending this one than I do about Heart of a Dog. But this one is the story of Sir Gawain, and this Green Knight shows up in King Arthur's court and ends up challenging them to a game. And Sir Gawain is kind of the person who takes it up. And the game is basically that they have a fight, and whatever you do to the Green Knight then gets to do to you a year later. And that's the setup, is that Sir Gawain has this fight with the Green Knight, and then he has to honor his end of the bargain and go meet the Green Knight a year later. So that's what this is about. It's very strange. He goes on this weird adventure to get to the Green Knight, and a lot of this book explores Gawain's identity and kind of what chivalry looked like in this time, and it's just really fascinating. I really enjoyed this one, way more than I would have thought. I hadn't read any of the Arthurian legend prior. I've realized I accidentally skipped something, because I have one book that's an ebook, so I didn't have it sitting in my pile, but I read this one for one of my undergraduate courses. This was for contemporary sociological theory, which I know just sounds fascinating if you're not into sociology, but we read, see if I can get this title cover pulled up here. This is Beasts of Burden by Cyrano Taylor, and this is the only nonfiction on this list. It's a really interesting book about the ways that the author sees disability rights and animal rights being connected. And it's a lot about how we talk about disability and how she feels that we can never truly tackle disability rights until we start tackling animal rights as well. And a lot of that has to do with the language that we use and kind of the structuring of society and how the world is built for people who aren't disabled and how we need to address that, and how it very similarly connects to the ways that we treat animals and how we see animals as separate from humans, because some of the language that we use suggests that we often see people with disabilities as different from able-bodied people, and therefore maybe less deserving of having access to the public world, which obviously isn't true, but a lot of our language kind of leans in that direction, and a lot of our policies lean in that direction. So it's about the connections between the two and the ways that Cyrano Taylor sees us potentially addressing these problems going forward, and maybe building new policies that are more inclusive and do encourage us to build more accessible communities and accessible public spaces. So I think this is really a fascinating read, and I'd like to go back and reread it because I haven't read it in quite a while. I read this in 2019, and it's very in-depth, and I think I need to reread it to kind of refresh my memory on her ideas. But I do remember just thinking it was really interesting, and it was definitely something I wouldn't have picked up on my own, but really, really interesting stuff, and really important stuff too, because there are just tons of people who are disabled who are excluded from so many parts of life because we haven't fixed our policies and fixed our infrastructure to allow them access to public spaces and to being a part of the public narrative. And I think that that's really important. Yeah, I just think this is a really fascinating read on that, and gets you really thinking about how we think about disability and how we might do better going forward. And then finally, I took a class on oceanic literature, so literature to do with like the oceans and movement across them, and I am recommending all three of the books that I read for that class. So first we read African Titanics by Abu Bakr Khalil, which is about Abdar, who is a migrant moving from Eritrea to Europe, I believe, and it's about just that experience of being a migrant and trying to get from his home to somewhere in Europe. All of the difficulties he faces and the people that he meets. And this is another book that made me cry. It's really fascinating and really heartbreaking in a lot of ways, and I think should be required reading. This is very much about modern day, like, immigration crises and refugee crises. It's very much about that, and about the ways that we treat people who are trying to immigrate to Europe and the US, is what I was trying to say. So I think that this is probably required reading, or it should be. I'm saying this as I did have to read this, but I think it should be more broadly read. And then next up, we read A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid. I think I said that other one was the only nonfiction. I was wrong. This is also nonfiction. This is about, I'm trying to remember the name of the island. I'm bad at geography. It's about Antigua, where Jamaica Kincaid grew up. And it's just like a nonfiction, kind of like three-part essay about Antigua and its history, and particularly about the effects of tourism on the island and the kind of lack of self-awareness that tourists tend to have on their impact on the island. So I think this is worth a read in terms of just also getting you thinking about like movements of people, and in this case tourism. Like, how does our tourism affect the people living in the places that we visit? I think this is also really salient with current conversations going on around like tourism in Hawaii too. So I think that the ideas in this book are still really salient and interesting, and I really enjoyed this, and I liked that this book pointed a finger at me and at, you know, everyone else who would go on a trip to Antigua or to Hawaii or places like that and said, think about what you're doing and how you're interacting with the places that you go to and what impact you're having. And also consider the history of those places and how globalization has impacted them and kind of what are the effects and what are these places like as a result of our actions. And then the last book I have here is also again about movement across oceans. This is Migratude by Shilja Patel. This is a poetry collection, very different from what I usually read, but this one is about the author's kind of personal history with migration. I believe she grew up in Kenya, I want to say, and then she's went to the UK for a time for school, and I think she splits her time with like the UK and the US as well. I think she also has maybe lived in the US for a while. I can't remember exactly. This is another one that I really need to go back and reread, but she's had a lot of experience with, you know, moving between places, but also it's about her family's history, because I believe her family's originally from India and then they moved to Kenya. So there's like this family history of migration, and then she ties all of that into a bigger global narrative of migration, both voluntary and forced, around the world, the kind of ways that these things all tie together and the impacts that they have on the people involved. It's just, again, a really fascinating read. All of these are really thought-provoking, and I think the kinds of things that, like, I read them for a very specific niche class, but I think these kinds of books should be required reading elsewhere as well. And even if you're not required to read them, I think you should read them anyway, because they will introduce you to so many big ideas that I think are worth thinking about and worth, you know, challenging your assumptions about. So I loved these, and I feel like this is a good place to stop, because this, first of all, is the end of the stack. I love all of these, but I think these are particularly worth reading. But that is all that I have for you today. So, you know, quick refresher. These are all of the books that I think are worth your time. But I would definitely love to hear your thoughts on any of these books down in the comments. And I would love to know what you thought of them, if you've read any of them. So let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.